Hello, philosophers. Congratulations on making your way through Lesson 2. Just a few words here for you at the end of this lesson. What I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about is philosophy as a discipline versus literature, so that you have a good chance to situate your mind before we begin our first set of literature readings. So I mentioned in the last screen that you were looking at that I expect that there's some concrete thinkers out there who are getting a little exhausted with all this sort of open-ended questioning that we have been doing so far. Questions are incredibly important in philosophy. This is where the desire to learn more about what is true comes from, is that you've got to start with the questioning. So we do spend a lot of time with that at the beginning of the class. Is ethics a science? Let's start there. It would seem not, right? Otherwise, we would have a little tidy textbook, like a math book. We would just work through it one problem at a time. And eventually, you would get to be more ethical if you got to Unit 10 as opposed to Unit 1, right? But as I pointed out with the Heinz dilemma, that's not the way ethics works, right? The particulars are always so messy, and they're always so particular. You can't expect to have a universal rule like the associative property work in every case where it looks like the associative property is going to work, as an analogy. The details in an ethical dilemma are always very, very messy. But most of you were not expecting that we were going to work through, an ethics textbook that would just, proceed to make us the most ethical people that we could be. In fact, I suspect that the vast majority of you are what we would call moral relativists. I think I linked to that earlier in the lesson. The idea here being that you believe in your heart of hearts that what is good or what is right is entirely dependent on the circumstances, which is not completely far off base, but I think it is a little problematic, as I'm going to go on to argue with you here. You believe that, history and situation and economic class and culture and all of these things really matter for the definition of what is good. And I agree, they do. However, for rightness to be rightness, just like for redness to be redness, or for a chair to be a chair, there needs to be something essential that is universal through all of those instances of red, through all of those instances of chairs. I bring up chairs because I was at a MoMA, a Museum of Modern Art exhibit in New York City some years ago, where the university had asked different artists to contribute chairs. And all of these different renditions of chairs. There were chairs made out of cactuses. There were chairs made out of plastic wrap. There were chairs made, just any possible thing that you could think of, a chair could be made of. It was made out of. And so it really made you think, what counts, right? What counts as a chair? Each of these exhibited something essential about what it means to be a chair. And certainly you all have played that game in your mind, that thought project, particularly if you were a 10-year-old, right? You thought, is the red that I see the red that somebody else sees? And that's where we're looking at. We're looking at, yes, red to be red needs to have something essential about it across all of the various instances where you might find red. So what I want for you this semester is to try to take off your moral relativist hat. Just for a moment, you can put it back on at the end of the semester. It's okay. But just for the moment, I want you to put on a philosopher's hat. And with that philosopher's hat, I want you to open your mind to the possibility that there is such a thing as universal right or universal good. We're going to use the words right and good throughout the semester. And that every time you see something that you say, hey, that was a right thing to do, that was the good thing to do, that you are seeing that just like you would be seeing red, and that there's something essential about the goodness or the rightness that you're seeing. And we want to try and get closer to that this semester. We want to see something objective. So in that way, yes, there is something about ethics that is more or less scientific, that deals with the objective world around us, or in this case with the humanities within us. So yes, that's what, it's a big ask. I realize that. And after you have played my little game this semester and tried to wear that philosopher's hat as opposed to the moral relativist hat, well, then you can put the moral relativist hat back on if you would like to. Because there are actually, I don't mean to confuse you, but there are philosophers who do that, who will argue for moral relativism. But before you can argue against something, you really need to see it from the inside and really appreciate the argument as much as you can. So a few more comments here about philosophy. Has anybody read any philosophers? I am hoping to find out from that introduction board. Hopefully maybe somebody has read a Platonic dialogue before, where Socrates is the main speaker. Maybe you've read some Aristotle, St. Augustine, St. Aquinas, Descartes, Locke, Hume, Hobbes, Mill, Kant, Hegel, Heidegger, Sartre, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Arendt, Derrida. Any of these names, maybe you've had some experience there. That would be great. I'm well aware, though, that most of you have never read any philosophy, and that's really exciting. I'm excited to be the person who introduces some of these people to you. The philosophers that we'll be reading this semester, you already saw listed in your syllabus. Mill, we'll start with him soon. Descartes, Hegel, Aristotle, Kant, Gilligan, Midgley, and Adams. And we'll give a brief nod to Teresa of Avila, too. She's a predecessor of Descartes, and I think Descartes stole some of her ideas. Anyway, so why I'm bringing all of this up is because philosophy is a certain kind of writing, right, that is not the same thing as literature. The writing is different, and so the reading that you're going to do, the way you read these texts, needs to be different, too. It needs to be different. So let's talk a little bit here about some of the differences. Let's see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 significant differences between philosophy and literature to talk to you about today to help orient you towards the kind of tone that you can expect from the philosophers that we're looking at. So with these 5 differences, just try and get your bearings a little bit. The first is that, obviously, hold on, before I get there, we're reading literature too, because by and large, literature tends to be easier to read. And so I'm pairing the literature with the philosophy to make the philosophy more accessible and to make it, to animate it a little bit. So the first thing I would suggest to you as being a major difference is that literature, by and large, tends to at least have a reputation for being more playful. I tend to think that philosophy is very playful. However, literature, I think most people would say, is the more playful. And what I mean by that is that in literature, you don't get the claim that this is how it is, right? That this is how things are. It's more, this is how this particular situation is. That's what you're going to see in a short story or in a novel. You're going to see this claim that this is how it was in this instance, right? Philosophers are looking not to be playful, which I kind of wince to say that because there's plenty of playfulness happening in philosophy, but it's of a different nature. Philosophers they're in a quest to say, this is what is. This is what is true. And so as a reader, you get to decide, does that sit well with you? When Descartes says to you that nothing in the world can be proved to be certain except for himself, he is making a claim about what is true. Not what is true for himself, but what he thinks is true. Just true, period, for everybody. So you as a human, this is your inheritance, right? You get to respond to that. You get to agree with it or disagree with it. But you need to do it in a meaningful way, right? So playfulness versus seriousness. That's the first of these 5 different ways of looking. And there's lots of them. The differences between philosophy and literature are many, many, many. I've already mentioned another one. Accessibility. Literature is generally a little easier for people to read. And philosophy is usually a little bit harder for people to read. Philosophy tends to be much more technical. A lot of philosophy depends on, as I've given a nod to, I think, in the last lesson, the whole task of simply defining your terms accurately. In literature, you're not going to see attention to definition and the painstaking nitty-grittiness of it. So that's the second point, is accessibility. Another way of looking at that is this third point, about logic versus insight, right? With literature, the truth that you see in a certain situation is, I would say that it's a kind of insight, that you just see the truth. And in philosophy, there's a lot of work done just with the logic, the painstaking step-by-step process to determine whether something is true. All right, then this is a big one. Questions. In literature, generally, the question is provided to you. This is what your creative fiction person teacher was saying that you needed, was a narrative hook, right? Something that grabs the reader in, that makes them understand that this is exciting, that this is something you want to see. You want to see what happens. You want to go somewhere with the question that's been raised, or the problem that's been raised. Philosophers assume that you already have that question burning in your soul, right? That you already want to know, say with Descartes, what is certain, what is true, what is real, that you already have that question, that you already have that desire. Philosophy actually means, etymologically, it comes from the Greek words philos and sophia, the love of wisdom, right? So love means that there's a desire, a lacking already in you that you want to fill by reading the text that you're reading. So oftentimes the question, it's not sold to you like it's sold in literature. The literature writer needs to sell you on why their book is interesting. The philosopher tends to assume that you already think that their book is interesting. And so what that means is that I cannot emphasize enough how important going to the text with some line of questioning already in your mind is. Because if that question is animated already for you, you'll be more interested to read what the answer is, right? So questioning is so important. All right, and then the last one, particularity versus universality. Literature tends to be about the particular, about this particular person having this particular problem. And philosophy tends to be about the universal, right? Like when we get to Hegel, we're going to talk about the problem of relationships. And he's not talking about the problem between two fictional characters in a romantic story, but he's talking about them too, that they're particular instances of what he's talking about. He's going to be talking about romantic relationships and friendships generally, for everybody, right? Universally. So that shift is really important. So we tend to think about literature being about the particular and philosophy being about the universal. However, I think I have this poem for you, The Laughing Heart by Charles Bukowski, as an example. I'm just going to read this through. As I read this, poetry is an interesting breed here, right? I hope there's a couple poets in the class. Poetry is an interesting breed. What's happening here? It seems like it's speaking to a very particular person in a very particular situation. But is it really that particular? So The Laughing Heart. Your life is your life. Don't let it be clubbed into dank submission. Be on the watch. There are ways out. There is light somewhere. It may not be much light, but it beats the darkness. Be on the watch. The gods will offer you chances. Know them. Take them. You can't beat death, but you can beat death in life sometimes. And the more often you learn to do it, the more light there will be. Your life is your life. Know it while you have it. You are marvelous. The gods wait to delight in you. And clearly this is a poem that is written to some specific person, but it could be written to all of us, right? And so what you see in poetry is what I think you also see in philosophy once you really get down to the brass tacks of it, is that what is most personal is actually what is most universal. They're not opposites. The particular and the universal are not as opposing as you might think. What is most universal is actually what is most particular. I'm reminded here too of the lines of the opening lines of Walt Whitman's poem, Song of Myself. He says, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. So put another way, what if what makes us most our individual selves, living our most full, thriving, vibrant life, is what makes all of us our fullest self? What if there's something really essential about the fullest human life? Wouldn't you like to know what it is? Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you like to know what it means to be a person of character? Have I got the class for you? Okay, anyway, to sum up, always read with a question, right? As I said before, reading without a question is like running in the dark without a goddamn flashlight. You need to have the question if you have any hope of getting through these texts, right? Luckily, the texts that I have here for you are not so hard, this first assignment. 3 pieces, all literary. I already have given you some questions in the study guide to kind of get your brain turning, but each in their own way addresses this question about what is an ethical action and what is not an ethical action. So as you read them, that's the main question I want you to be considering, is cataloging ethical and unethical actions. The dates for the writers, I will always be giving you the dates and the places that the writers lived and worked in so that you can maybe write them down on a page in your journal or notebook for this class. It's nice to kind of see the timeline coalescing. So Virginia Woolf is the first one. She is the writer of the short essay, The Death of the Moth, beautiful piece about life and the death of a moth. Born in 1882, dies in 1941. In the river with rocks in her pockets. Spent most of her life in London. Most of you are probably familiar with her already. Gabriel Garcia Marquez, born in 1927, dying in 2014, living most of his life in Colombia, in South America. Best known for 100 Years of Solitude, Love in the Time of Cholera, made magical realism as a style very prominent, right? Thirdly, Albert Camus. We're reading one of the essays written by him when he was very young, I think 21 or 22, so you can eat your humble pie while you're reading the words of somebody who is as old as most of you that we're still reading today. Pretty exciting. Born in 1913, died in 1960, living most of his life in Algeria and then later in France. And a nice story to connect with Camus, one of the fathers of existentialism, although he would have denied being that, was that he died. Sorry to be talking about death so much, but hey, it's a philosophy class, right? He died in a car crash on a beautiful day with a ticket for a train in his pocket. He had decided to forego taking the train that day and instead drove and ended up dying as a result. You just never can tell, right? So as you read these pieces, as I've said, the main question I want you to be thinking about is what's an ethical action, what's an unethical action, how do you recognize them? And then also be thinking about the text map that we've been looking at. All of those key terms in there are links that I want you to try and link the key term, say life, for example, or ethical action, for example, or even conflict, and link it to a specific scene or action in these 3 literary pieces for the Bridges assignment. So that's open now. It closes on the 25th at 11:55 p.m. The specific directions, everybody needs to have a new post and several reply posts. So take a look at those directions and get started on that now. And lastly, please remember to write in your texts as much as possible. Underline, highlight, little notes here, little notes there, and to look up any words that you don't know. So that is it. Please remember I am available to you. I'm very happy to have office visits. I'm very happy to have emails. I'm very happy to have you post on Class Forum, the Class Forum board on the main page of our Moodle site. Let's make this class work for you because that's why I'm doing it. Okay, good luck.